Red lights bled across the pavement as Officer Rowan shouted straight into his face. Savage, a ragged black man driving a luxury car. "Get out now, before I drag your corpse out." Darius Cole clenched his jaw, eyes sharp. "Touch me, and you'll be digging a grave for your career." Rowan slapped him hard, the sharp crack echoing like a blow to the crowd's collective dignity. He growled, "Here I am the law, and you're nothing but trash." Darius spat blood onto the asphalt, pulled out a gleaming badge, and held it close to Rowan's face. "And I'm the one with the power to bury you, Officer Rowan." Late in the day, the long stretch of suburban road glowed under the fading sun, the wind carrying the damp scent of an earlier rain. Trees lined the roadside, their shadows pooling across the asphalt in blotches of golden light. The calm seemed intact until it was ripped apart by the shrill wail of a police siren. A white and blue cruiser screeched to a halt, red lights flashing in a strobe, cutting off a sleek black sedan. Tires screamed against the pavement, and passers-by flinched and turned. For a moment, the entire block held its breath. The cruiser door flew open. Officer Blake Rowan stepped out, his heavy frame wrapped in a dark blue uniform, boots striking the ground with the force of someone crushing the rights of whoever he had in his sights. The patrol car's lights flared across his flushed face, eyes narrowed in contempt. He shouted, voice sharp and deliberate, out of the car. "A black guy driving this kind of vehicle. Where'd you steal it from?" It wasn't a question meant for an answer, but a bare-knuckled insult with hostile intent. The sedan door opened. Darius Cole emerged. He stepped out, tall and squared, his broad shoulders framed by a blue suit that still shimmered faintly in the twilight. But what made the crowd fall silent wasn't his clothes, it was the calm, cold face and the stare. He leveled at Rowan, steady, like he'd met hatred like this too many times before. Darius didn't hurry, didn't stall. He stepped onto the pavement as if the sirens had never shaken the ground beneath him. A street vendor froze, still clutching a bag of red apples, eyes darting between the two figures. A few cars behind slowed down, drivers leaning out their windows, faces tense, drawn by a mix of fear and curiosity. Rowan stepped closer, closing the gap to a breath's width. He sneered, his voice soaked in disdain. "Someone like you can't afford this car. I bet those papers are fake. Why, think you can fool me?" Darius lifted his gaze, his voice low and even, each word clear and unwavering. "You've stopped the wrong man, Rowan." The calm only made Rowan bristle more. He snapped back, face inches away. "Don't talk to me like that. I am the law here. If you don't start explaining, I'll let my cuffs do the talking." Bystanders began to gather. A teenager quietly raised his phone camera, trembling in his hands. Red police lights flickered across their faces, casting unease. An old woman pulled her grandchild back from the curb, muttering, "Don't get involved. It's dangerous." Her whisper cut through the stiff air like a silent curse. Rowan barked, "Papers now." Darius silently pulled out his wallet, handed over his license and registration. Rowan didn't bother to look. He snatched them, then flung them to the ground, the documents gliding low in the wind. He laughed, bitter and loud. "You think this trash proves anything I've seen in toilet paper with more value?" Darius bent to pick up the papers, his movements slow, unshaken. He raised his head, eyes locking on Rowan, not furious, but carrying a chill that cut straight to the bone. The crowd murmured, and a few sharp breaths broke the silence. A young man mumbled, "He's crazy tossing a license like that." Someone tugged his sleeve, whispering, "Keep quiet, or we'll get dragged in." Rowan stepped forward, hand resting on his belt fingers, brushing the grip of his gun, a silent threat. "Lean on the car, hands on the hood." His voice sliced the air like a blade. Darius glanced around, catching glimpses of faces, turned down eyes that peeked only to look away just as quickly. He spoke calm as ever. "Do you really believe violence and humiliation are how you prove power?" A sharp gust swept through, rustling the leaves, but answered except Rowan. He hissed, Don't preach to me, you lowlife. Each word spat like filth into the air, making some in the crowd wince. A boy tugged at his father's arm, asking softly, "Why is that man being arrested? What did he do wrong?" The father pulled him away, eyes flickering with quiet shame as he avoided the question. Rowan leaned in, breath heavy between them. "Speak. Where'd you steal the car? Or are you running drugs? Filthy blood, that's what you've got." The crowd stood frozen at the raw cruelty. A young woman raised her hand to her mouth, eyes wide, phone still in her grasp as she quietly tapped record. Darius let a smirk touch his lips, his voice dropping into a blade's edge, cold and sharp. "You're exposing yourself, Rowan. And trust me, every word you just said will become the harshest sentence of your life." Rowan laughed loud and hard, fingers tapping the gun's handle, each click a threat. "Who the hell do you think you're lecturing me? I am the law here." Darius held his gaze, didn't flinch, didn't step back. In that moment, the street turned into a quiet battlefield, one side yelling for power, the other grounded in unshakable calm. The street vendor backed away, muttering, "This isn't gonna end well." A few cars behind honked, not out of impatience, but like they were trying to shatter the tension, swelling to its breaking point. Rowan didn't care. He jabbed a finger at Darius's chest, barking, "On your knees before I put a bullet in you." The patrol lights blinked wildly, flickering over Darius Cole's frozen, steel-cold face. He didn't move, only let his lips curl slightly, eyes cutting through all the hate. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, Rowan." The air snapped. Everyone held still. Each second stretched endlessly. And that nighttime stop at that exact moment was no longer just routine. It had become the spark to a powder keg called injustice. The police siren fell silent, leaving behind a tense stillness heavy with pressure. The flashing red lights spilled across the pavement, casting their glow on the pale faces of onlookers. Rowan stood face to face with Darius, his breath thick with the stench of tobacco, eyes squinting with pure disdain. He leaned in close, hissing through clenched teeth. "Someone like you with skin like that could never afford a car like this. Show me your papers." The words flew like blades, not just aimed at one man, but at the entire community behind him. Darius reached into his jacket and pulled out a dark leather wallet. Slowly, without urgency, he slid out his driver's license and registration, his movements deliberate, as if to show he had nothing to fear. The documents caught the light of the flashing patrol car, but before anyone could take a proper look, Rowan snatched them away, glanced for a second, then flung them hard to the ground. The license spun through the air and landed with a slap on the asphalt. Rowan scoffed, his smile curling with contempt. "Fake papers. This garbage doesn't prove you're clean." The scattered crowd along the sidewalk began to murmur. A middle-aged man leaned toward his wife and muttered, "He doesn't look like a criminal, but when the cops say something, who dares argue?" A younger man, gripping a phone hidden in his jacket pocket, glanced up and quietly hit record, his palm damp with sweat. The girl beside him whispered, "Don't what if he sees you?" But the young man kept filming, shielding the screen light as if something inside him knew this moment had to be captured. Darius bent down and picked the license off the dusty street. He brushed it off, stood up, and met Rowan's eyes again. The calm was gone. Now his stare was cold, sharp. His brow tightened, the corner of his mouth curved into a bitter smirk. "I don't need to pretend to be the kind of man you expect." His voice rang out steady and measured, each word landing like a slap across the smugness on Rowan's face. Rowan paused for a beat, then let out a loud guttural laugh soaked in ridicule. "Oh, listen to this trash. You people are always running your mouths, always crying about being discriminated against. But when I ask for papers, you pull out fakes. I've seen hundreds like you sitting in fancy cars, then showing your true cowardly face." He jerked his chin toward the crowd, raising his voice so all could hear. "Look at this circus. Seen it before. Don't think a shiny suit and clean car make you a gentleman? The blood in their veins is still as filthy as the gutter. The words echoed, bouncing off the silence, sending chills through a few witnesses. A young woman covered her mouth, eyes wide with horror. Nearby, a boy, around 10, clutched his mother's hand and whispered, "Why is that man being called that?" The mother pulled him close, voice trembling. "Hush, look away." Fear settled over them, like a thick fog smothering any thought of speaking up. Darius stood, firm, fingers gently tightening around the edge of his papers, drawing a deep breath as if to hold his calm. He stared straight into Rowan's eyes. No flinch, no retreat. "You think insults can break me? The more you speak, the more you expose who you really are to the whole world." His voice echoed softly, bouncing off the wall of silence and stirring curiosity in the eyes of those watching. Rowan's face flushed red. He stepped closer, nose nearly touching forehead, voice shrieking, "Shut up. You don't get to lecture me. If I say you're a thief, then you're a damned thief. If I say you're trash, then you'll end up in the trash. Got it?" He yelled loud enough for everyone to hear, turning the humiliation into a public sentence. A few sharp breaths broke from the crowd, whispers threading through. A young man shook his head. "He's gone too far." Someone beside him murmured, "Everyone sees it, but who dares step in? You want to get beaten up?" The brief exchange only deepened the weight of helplessness pressing on a crowd strangled by fear. Darius held his stare and his voice turned colder, each word cutting into the air. "The louder you shout, the more you show your weakness. Real strength doesn't come from a gun, but from a mind that knows how to think." He paused, eyes unwavering as if daring the flames of hate pouring out from his opponent. Rowan froze for a beat, then burst into a mocking laugh. The harsh sound struck the chests of those nearby. He turned halfway toward the crowd, pointing at Darius. "Did you hear that? A black man thinking he can teach me how to live? Go ahead. Laugh. All of you laugh at this clown." He wanted the crowd to become an audience to his humiliation. But instead of laughter, a heavy silence settled in, eyes shifting quietly between each other, more anxious than amused. A bead of sweat slid down Darius's temple, but his voice held steady. He spoke slowly, each word tightly, holding back anger, but also serving as a warning. "You've already made a fool of yourself, Rowan." A few in the crowd raised their brows, a flicker of hidden agreement flashing through their eyes. Rowan clenched his teeth and stepped in, yanking Darius by the collar, growling, "You wanna die? No one's saving you here. I have the right to arrest you, throw you on the ground, and no one will say a damn word." His voice pressed hard, trying to trap Darius in a corner. The young man, filming, held his breath, hand trembling as he gripped his phone. Each second dragged heavy and slow, but within his frame, the truth was recording itself. A street corner, a police officer, and a human being publicly humiliated. No one had spoken yet, but every glance, every press of the record button proved that silence did not mean forgetting. Rowan clenched the collar tighter, his voice dropping low, but still seething with venom. "I could crush you right now, and don't expect anyone to testify. You're just a shadow in the night." Darius stared deep into his eyes, pupils flashing, and replied flatly, "You'll see tonight the darkness won't hide anything." That answer made Rowan loosen his grip slightly, as if in that instant he sensed this man wasn't like the others he'd bullied before. But rage quickly swallowed the hesitation. He jerked Darius's collar hard and roared, "I'll make you regret ever opening your mouth." The air tightened. The crowd remained silent, but something had shifted in their eyes. A few more phones appeared hidden in the dark. The public insult had turned the traffic stop into a stage where one man drunk on power unveiled his true face and another stood firm to show that his silence was not weakness, but the patience to wait for the moment to turn everything around. Of fear. But Darius didn't move, didn't resist, didn't back down. Rowan was done with the words. He lunged forward, using his full weight to slam Darius against the gleaming hood of the sedan. The sharp clang of metal echoed down the quiet street loud enough to make a few bystanders flinch and step back. The patrol lights kept flashing red and blue streaks spilling across the pavement, clearly outlining the posture of one man pressing down and another being forced into submission. Rowan's rough hand slid to his belt, brushing the grip of his gun like a warning. His voice came low and sharp. "Don't move, or I'll shoot. Black men always hide contraband." His breath hit Darius's ear, a harsh mix of smoke and sweat. Rowan gritted his teeth, his free hand rummaging through Darius's jacket and pants pockets with deliberate force. Every touch was more than assert. It was a blatant act of humiliation. He wanted to turn Darius into a spectacle, a prop for showcasing police power. Darius tilted his head, voice steady but cutting through the arrogance like a blade. "You're exceeding your authority." The words hit Rowan's ears hard, making him pause for a split second. But then came a low, gravelly laugh full of contempt. "Exceeding authority. You think authority has limits for someone like you? If I want to search, I'll search. If I want to break your bones, I've got that right." He shoved Darius's shoulder down harder, the hood creaking under the pressure. The crowd stood frozen. Some eyes turned away, some phones lifted, then dropped quickly when Rowan glanced their way. An elderly woman across the street clutched her shopping bag, her face pale. Everyone knew what they were witnessing was wrong, but fear sealed their throats, locking them into the role of silent witnesses. Just then, a boy around 10 walked by holding his father's hand. His eyes widened at the scene, lips trembling. "Why is that man being arrested?" he asked, his voice clear and childlike, drawing a few heads to lift in response. The father tightened his grip and pulled him along, head bowed, saying nothing. He couldn't answer, didn't dare. The silence of the grown-ups dropped like a wall, leaving the question hanging in the air, pressing into the hearts of those who heard it. Rowan heard the question, glanced over, then burst into raucous laughter. "See that? Even the kid wants to know why a black man's in a luxury car. I'll show everyone his pockets, his trunk. They're full of the crap he's hiding." He snatched the car keys from Darius's hand, yanking them like a thief. Darius turned his head, his voice sharpening, not loud, but each word striking like a hammer. "You're turning yourself into a criminal right in front of all these people. And remember, every move you make today will come back to crush your career." His eyes burned bright, not with fear but with a cold, unwavering resolve. Rowan hesitated for half a beat, but pride made him snap. "Who are you trying to scare? This whole street will testify that I'm just doing my job." He flung the car door open, leaned inside, and rummaged through the glove compartment, tossing papers, a pen, and a stack of documents onto the pavement. Each item hit the ground with a sharp, jarring thud, like another blow to Darius's dignity. The crowd's murmurs grew louder. A middle-aged man whispered, "This is too much, clearly too much." Someone beside him leaned in and warned, "Careful, if he sees you, you're in trouble." Phones lit up again in the dark, this time more of them, more cautiously, like a small wave beginning to swell. Rowan spun around, eyes blazing, catching a glimpse of someone raising their phone. He roared, "Put the phone away. Anyone filming, I'll arrest you on the spot." The crowd flinched. Some lowered their phones quickly, but others kept them up, pretending to text. The fear now mingled with rising outrage, thickening the air. Darius turned his head toward the crowd, his eyes scanning the tense faces before settling, sending a silent message. He spoke softly, just loud enough for Rowan to hear, "You can arrest me, but you can't make this truth disappear." Rowan froze, a flicker of unease flashing through him, but rage smothered it instantly. He shouted, as if trying to drown everything out, "I'll prove to everyone you were born a criminal. None of you is getting away." He stepped in closer, resumed the search, yanking at every fold of clothing and corner of each pocket with no regard for the dignity of the man in front of him. A cold gust swept through, flipping the sign in front of a nearby store. In that moment, the anger in the watching crowd began to shake under the weight of restraint. They knew they were witnessing something indefensible, but the fear of power forced them all into silence. Darius clenched his teeth, breath heavy, but his voice stayed calm. The more you do, the more you show everyone you're not worthy of that uniform. Rowan let out a shrill laugh, sharp and piercing. I wear this uniform to crush people like you got that. Just then, the boy from earlier looked back, eyes wide and fixed on Darius. His lips moved, forming silent words, but his father pulled him away around the corner. The innocent question still hung heavy in the stifling air. Why is someone being arrested when they've done nothing wrong? And why does a whole crowd stay silent while watching such blatant humiliation? Amid the distant wail of police sirens and the flashing lights slicing like blades through the dark, that degrading search carved a lasting wound into the memory of every witness. And for Darius, every word, every rough touch did not strip away his dignity. It only hardened his resolve, because the moment of truth was now closer than ever. The evening air turned chilly dust, rising from the road with each passing car. On the sidewalk, tension had squeezed the breath out of everyone. After the humiliating search, Rowan stood upright, sweat forming on his temple, but his eyes still burned with hatred. He scanned the crowd, his gaze sharp enough to pierce through every glance sneaking in his direction. At that moment, a woman with brown hair tied back raised her phone with trembling hands, camera pointed toward him and Darius. The screen flashed, catching the red and blue strobe of the police lights. That image flared like a spark in the silent dark. Rowan spotted it instantly. He spun around and shouted, voice hoarse and shrill, "Put it away, or you want to go to jail." The crowd jolted. Several people quickly ducked their heads and shoved their phones into their pockets as if they themselves had been targeted. The woman bit her lip, her hand shaken but refusing to lower the phone. Instead of holding it up, she dropped it closer to her chest, tucked it tight against her coat, hiding the screen in her palm with only a narrow gap left to record. Her breath-raced heart pounding so loud she could hear it herself, but her fingers held their place. Rowan stepped forward, boots striking the pavement with a chilling thud. He swept his gaze over the crowd, voice grinding out each word. "Anyone filming, I'll arrest on the spot. I'll confiscate every phone and I'll teach each of you what it means to disrespect an officer." He held his head high, trying to cast himself as a figure of absolute authority, but his rage betrayed something more violent than commanding. Darius stood straight beside him, the cruiser lights washing across one cheek, now marked red from being forced against the hood. He said nothing, but his eyes stayed locked on the woman. For a moment their gazes met, and it was Darius's steady look that gave her courage. She nodded slightly, as if promising herself she would not miss capturing this, no matter how much her hands shook. Rowan turned back to Darius, a dry, harsh laugh slipping out. "Look at that. The audience loves this clown show." He jerked his chin toward the crowd, voice thick with mockery. "You like putting on a show, huh? Stand there, let me show the whole street your real face." The words cut through the already heavy air like a blade. The bystanders bowed their heads, holding in emotion, none daring to react, but that silence only made his words echo louder. Darius raised his head high, meeting Rowan's blazed eyes, his voice low, but each word clear enough for all to hear. "One day you'll regret this moment." It wasn't a shout, it wasn't loud, but it was sharp and carried the weight of a prophecy. The crowd shivered, and a few people in the shadows exchanged glances as if they had just heard something they would remember forever. Rowan burst out laughing, his voice echoing across the corner of the street. He pointed at Darius, jerking his chin toward the crowd. "Listen to him. A black man daring to challenge the police? What a joke of the century." He whipped around to face the woman, still clutching her phone. "You think filming changes anything? That video won't save him. In fact, I'll drag you to the ground right here." He stomped toward her. The woman trembled but held her composure, pressing the phone tighter to her chest, head lowered in a show of fear. Inside her coat pocket, the camera kept recording, capturing every second. Darius stared straight at Rowan, and his voice rose into the silence. clear and steady. "You just proved you're afraid of the truth, because if you believed you were right, you wouldn't need to stop others from seeing." The words dropped like a stone into still water, rippling through the crowd. The murmuring grew louder, and more phones were quietly pulled out. Small lights flickered to life, timid but unwavering like candles lit against the dark. Rowan spun again, face red with rage. "Anyone pulls out another phone, I'll shoot." He roared, his hand on the grip of his gun metal, glinting under the flashing patrol lights. The crowd recoiled, but this time no one backed down. Fear still lingered, but it was now clashing with the slow rise of smoldering defiance. In that moment, a sigh came from behind the crowd, audible and firm. An elderly man with silver hair stepped forward with a cane. His voice was low but steady. "Keep recording. This needs to be seen. The whole city needs to see this." His simple words were like wind fanning coals into flame. More phones were raised higher, screen lights glowing white in the night. Rowan froze for a second, not expecting his show of force to ignite resistance. Darius didn't look over, but the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. He knew the silence had started to crack. Eyes no longer looked away. Hands no longer hid their trembling. They were still afraid, but now that fear had a name, and once fear is named, it can be defeated. Rowan tightened his grip on the gun, exhaled, then stepped back toward Darius, trying to patch the unraveling with more aggression. He leaned in, voice low and threatening. "I'll crush you right here to prove no one can stand against me." But Darius didn't move, didn't lower his head, didn't take a step back. His eyes still burned under the flashing red and blue lights. The entire street seemed to freeze. The tension wove itself into steel wires wrapping around every breath. The woman still held her phone tight in her coat pocket, her fingers trembling but steady on the record button. And in that very moment, though no one yet knew it, the history of the city cracked, marking the beginning of a wave that could never be stopped. The air on the suburban street had thickened into something hard to breathe. Red and blue lights from the patrol car still flashed nonstop, casting jolting beams across tense faces, turning everyone into statues that tremble. Rowan stood facing Darius, his fist clenched tight, veins bulging along his neck. His voice scraped out sharp as metal grinding stone. "Answer me, where did you steal the car from?" It was no longer a question, but a suspended sentence, a noose. He was ready to tighten around the neck of the man in front of him. Darius raised his head high, his eyes unwavering. His deep voice rang out, each word heavy like a stone hitting pavement, bouncing straight into the ears of everyone standing there. "I don't need to steal to survive, but you're stealing your own dignity." A chilling silence spread. No one dared to breathe too loudly. The words cut like a blade through the mask of authority Rowan had tried to wear, revealing the raw face of a man who used humiliation as a weapon. Rowan froze for a beat, his eyes flaring red with fury. He hissed through clenched teeth, face twisted by the blow to his pride. In a split second, all his restraint shattered. A sharp, searing crack split the air, slicing through the tension like a whip. Rowan's rough hand struck Darius across the face, whipping his head to the side. The dark skin flushed red, the imprint of a palm burned into his cheek, undeniable, visible proof. The crowd gasped, a chaotic burst of horror, of stifled outrage, of helplessness, unable to explode. Phones jerked up lenses, shaken to capture what had just happened. A woman cried out softly, hand over her mouth, eyes wide with disbelief. A young man whispered to his friend, "Oh my God, he actually hit him." But those murmurs vanished into a silence heavier than gunfire because not one person dared step in. Darius slowly turned his head back, blood beaten at the corner of his mouth and trailing down. But his eyes, instead of breaking or retreating, gleamed brighter, deeper, like a pit ready to swallow the man before him. He didn't speak right away. He let the sound of the slap hang in the air, let the insult echo under dozens of fearful but watching eyes. Rowan stared back, his hand still burning, fingers trembling, whether from a flicker of guilt or the rush of power was unclear. He looked around at the crowd, then shouted as if trying to justify himself with his own voice, "You see that he's defiant? He disobeyed a police order. I have the right to teach him a lesson." But his voice voice was different now, not solid and commanding, but hoarse, with a trace of fear he hadn't yet noticed. A child in the crowd burst into tears, carried away quickly in his mother's arms. A few elders shook their heads, eyes brimming with pain and helplessness. A young man clenched his phone tightly, lips pressed shut, eyes blazing with fury, but his feet stayed rooted to the sidewalk, unable to step forward. Injustice had unfolded right before them, raw and undeniable, but the power held by the one with the gun had shackled every movement, turning them into unwilling witnesses. Darius wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth, the motion slow and deliberate, then looked straight at Rowan. That gaze held no simple hatred. It was deep proud, as if to declare to everyone watching he could be struck, but he would never be broken. The tension in the air was so dense that only the sound of wind rustling through the trees and the tight, heavy breathing of the crowd could be heard. Rowan met that gaze, a flicker of unease running through him, but he didn't retreat. He shouted into the air as if to silence the fear rising inside him, "I am the law here. No one's saving you." The words rang out, but their force was no longer absolute, because the moment his hand lashed out, every hidden phone had captured it, every eye had seen. And the verdict for him, though not yet spoken, was already forming in the shared consciousness of the people around him. Darius took a deep breath, then spoke, his voice not loud but sharp as steel. "You hit me in the face, but what you really broke was the truth you've been trying to bury, and that truth will destroy you." His words echoed like a curse, like an indictment. The crowd stayed silent, no applause, no cries, but something had shifted in their eyes, agreement awakening. Rowan panted, his eyes darting, but he kept his chin up, hand once again resting on his gun, as if violence was the only way left to hold his position. But in that moment, he didn't yet know that what had just happened was beyond his control. That slap, meant to humiliate Darius, had instead made him the one who humiliated himself before the crowd, before the camera, before history. The suburban night was still and windless, but the atmosphere churned like a storm. Everyone understood that after that humiliating slap, nothing would ever be the same. A crack had opened, and through it the light of truth would begin to seep in, tearing through the mask of power Rowan once wore with pride. Dusk had completely fallen, and the entire street was swallowed by darkness, lit only by the red and blue lights flickering non-stop from the patrol car, casting flickering shadows on the building walls and the tense faces of the crowd. The air grew more suffocating than ever, like a cramped room without oxygen where every breath felt heavy. Wind hissed through the roadside trees, mixing with distant sirens, creating a chaotic soundtrack to a confrontation no one wanted to witness, but no one dared to walk away from. Rowan stood blocking Darius' eyes, bloodshot and wide, breath ragged like a cornered beast. He hissed, his words ground out through clenched teeth. "Bow your head, you savage." The sound cracked through the space like a whip. Darius stood tall, unmoving. He wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth, hand trembling slightly, but eyes fixed. In that moment, he looked like a boulder rooted in the middle of a raging river. Though the current surged, the stone held firm. He spoke softly, voice low but clear. "You are not the law. You're just a man in a uniform." That line cut straight through the wall of silence. The crowd shuddered. Someone inhaled sharply and another turned away in fear of Rowan's gaze. For a few seconds, all sound seemed to stop, leaving only the thunder of hearts pounding inside chests. Rowan flinched at the response, his face twisted with rage, lips curling into a snarling laugh. "You dare! You dare talk to me like that!" He raised the same hand that had slapped Darius before, twitching as if ready to strike again. But it was the steady stare from Darius that made him hesitate. In that gaze, there was no pleading, no fear, only quiet defiance, as if reflecting every stain Rowan tried to hide. At the edge of the crowd, the woman still held her phone hidden. She kept it tucked tightly inside her coat, exposing only the small opening where the lens peeked through. Her hand trembled with every beat of her racing heart, each thump like a drum in her chest. She knew that being caught could lead to serious consequences, but she also knew what was happening had to be recorded. That tiny lens in this moment had become the only weapon against the fury masked as authority. Rowan leaned in closer, breath hot and rancid in Darius's face. "Who do you think you are? Trash, like you daring to stand tall in front of me. Do you think anyone will stand with you? Look around. Nothing but silence. No one's going to save you." He emphasized every word, trying to wrap them like chains around the man standing in front of him. Darius lifted his head, his eyes steady, and replied in a calm voice, sharp as steel. "You're wrong. The silence today isn't agreement. It's evidence, and that evidence will become your verdict." He spoke slowly, every word striking like an arrow at the core of Rowan's pride. The crowd heard those words, and a few eyes lit up no longer, fully avoiding his gaze. A teenager bit his lip fists, clenched as if he wanted to shout, but held back. The woman filming breathed harder, fingers tightening, afraid that a single mistake might cost her the moment. Rowan screamed as if to drown out the tremors, shaking his control. "Trash. Nothing you say matters. I have the authority. I'm the police. I can do whatever I want." He yanked his gun from its holster, raised it to eye level, and the glint of metal made the crowd collectively recoil, hearts skipping a beat. A few screams broke out, chaotic but quickly stifled. No one dared move forward. Everyone could only keep their distance. Darius stared directly into the barrel, his eyes steady. His voice rang low, each word hitting like a bell in the night. "The higher you raise that gun, the more you prove you're not the law. Your fear wearing its uniform. You can shoot, but that bullet will betray you." Rowan trembled for a second, but he immediately shouted louder, "Shut up!" The scream echoed, blending with the flashing lights, sending a shiver down the street. But even with the gun in his hand, his grip trembled slightly, no longer as certain. From the crowd, a whisper broke through. "He's right." A small voice, but enough for those nearby to hear, and their expressions began to shift. The fear hadn't vanished, but something else had begun to stir, threading its way through the thick air. The woman with the phone was shaking so hard her palms were drenched in sweat. She knew every second passing was another priceless piece of evidence. The image of Rowan pointing a gun at an unarmed man paired with his hateful words would turn into a blade aimed back at him. She held her breath steady, keeping the camera recording. Darius drew a deep breath and his voice rang out to close the dark exchange. "You may think tonight is your victory, but this is the beginning of your end, Rowan." The atmosphere held still. Patrol lights kept flashing, casting sharp streaks across the strained faces. The crowd had not moved, but their eyes were different now, no longer completely submissive. They had heard, they had seen, and the evidence was still being held in a trembling, determined hand. That dialogue, dark and full of venom, etched a deeper crack into the wall of power once thought unshakable, and that very crack would soon open into a collapse no one could stop. The echo of the slap still rang in everyone's mind, the streak of blood on Darius's lip, stark under the flashing lights, and the whole street seemed frozen. The silence stretched threatening to swallow every reaction until suddenly, from the back of the crowd, a young man with a boyish face shouted, his voice cracking with fury. "Why did you hit him?" The outburst was like a stone hurled into a frozen lake, shattering the quiet that had long settled over them. Eyes immediately turned toward Rowan, for the first time no longer entirely avoiding him. Rowan whipped around, his gaze blazing, and his hand instantly dropped to hover near the grip of his gun, the motion clear and threatening. He growled through his teeth, "Anyone want to try me?" The words struck the air like a weapon, turning the brief flicker of defiance into fear. The crowd recoiled dozens of steps, scuffing back on the asphalt. The murmurs died instantly. Silence returned heavier than before, this time not only filled with fear, but laced with shame. Darius stood firm, his eyes scanning the crowd, catching the faces turned downward. The blinking eyes that quickly looked away, the hands clutching phones that no one dared to raise. He bowed his head slightly, and his voice quiet but Cuttin reached those nearby, each word like a drill to the core. This silence is the most dangerous weapon of all. The sentence made a few people shiver. A young woman clutched her purse, eyes brimming, lips trembling but unable to speak. The teenager who had shouted was pulled back by a friend, his face still flushed with anger, eyes locked on Rowan as if battling the fear inside him. A few sighs escaped from the elderly. Standing by the corner, they had seen too many moments like this, but never found the strength to stop them. Rowan turned back to face Darius, his rage twisting his face. He shouted to overpower the moment. You see that everyone's silent. No one's on your side. You're alone. He wanted to turn their retreat into proof of his control, to make their fear a shield for his guilt. But at that very moment, Darius raised his head, his eyes sweeping across the crowd. Blood still dripped from his wounded lip, the red streak sharp against his skin, but his voice rose calm and resolute. No one speaking doesn't mean they didn't see, and you know that, Rowan. Every eye here is evidence. You can make them lower their heads, but you can't erase what they've witnessed. The words cut through the silence like a blade. A hollow space opened in the air as if everyone had just realized a truth too obvious to deny, yet no one dared to say it aloud. The woman, clutching the phone in her pocket, trembled violently, fingers gripping tighter, determined not to stop recording. She knew every word from Darius was turning her secret action into a small flame, a flame that would soon erupt into a raging fire. Rowan, noticing the flicker of defiance beginning to show in a few faces in the crowd, growled instantly, hand clamped hard on the grip of his gun, boots stomping the pavement. Shut up, all of you, or I'll make sure every one of you gets a taste of a jail cell. His voice boomed, but this time it no longer drowned everything out. In the thick air, people began to hear their own heavy breathing, and injustice now loomed like a wild beast no one could restrain. A child sobbed, the cry quickly muffled by a mother's hand, but the sound still echoed down the street. The adults, once silent, now began to feel ashamed of their own quiet. They didn't step forward, but their eyes no longer looked fully down, and even that fragile shift was enough to frustrate Rowan. He stepped back, eyes flaring at Darius, then swept his glare across the crowd, searching for submission like before. But what met him now were stares, half fearful, half furious, like needles piercing skin. In that moment, Darius closed his eyes briefly, then opened them, his voice lowered but striking straight to the heart. Silence might protect him tonight, but tomorrow it will destroy us. The crowd held its breath. Rowan gripped the gun tighter, but inside he could feel it. Control was no longer fully his. The crack had formed, and once it did, it would spread no matter how loud he shouted or how hard he threatened. On the dark street, police lights continued flashing, lighting up faces that were both frightened and awakening. A quiet rage had taken root, and all it needed was a moment to ignite and burn through the silence that had once ruled this place. The street, already thick with shouting and fear, now felt even heavier as the flashing police lights cast warped red and blue shadows across walls and pavement. The crowd's breathing was short and fast, hearts pounding out of rhythm, yet no one dared to step beyond the invisible line Rowan had drawn with the grip of his gun. Cold wind swept down the sidewalk, carrying scraps of paper and dust, but it couldn't clear the suffocating pressure bearing down on everyone. In that scene, Rowan pressed his face close to Darius's, his eyes blazing veins bulging at his neck, and he roared hoarse and sharp, "Who do you think you are, standing up to me?" That voice cut through the air, reaching every ear, turning the crowd into unwilling witnesses. A woman holding her child turned away but couldn't block the child's ears. The little one sobbed wide-eyed in terror. A few young men, still gripping phones in their pockets, held their lips tight, eyes burning, but their feet stayed frozen on the pavement. Everyone assumed Darius would break at that moment, that he would crumble under the insult and the waiting barrel of the gun. But Darius didn't flinch, didn't step back. His eyes locked on Rowan's. The blood on his lip had dried into a deep red line, making his face look even fiercer. In the thick silence, he slowly reached into his suit pocket, the motion so calm it made the entire crowd hold its breath, fearing he might pull something dangerous. Rowan instantly tensed, fingers tightening around his gun, eyes wide, shouting, "What are you doing?" Hands down, but Darius remained composed, pulling a leather wallet from his pocket under the weight of every watching eye. He opened it, drawing out something gleaming metal, catching the flashing light in sharp streaks. He raised it high, his voice cutting through the air, steady and sharp. "Head of Internal Affairs." The crowd froze as if every sound had been sucked from the street. 1 second passed, then 2, and then came the eruption gasps of disbelief breaking out everywhere. Dozens of phones were raised instantly, this time with no attempt to hide them. Cameras pointed forward, flashlights burst like strobe lights, capturing every impossible detail. Darius's face shone bright in the bursts of white. No longer just a black man, stopped and humiliated, but now the embodiment of a power far beyond Rowan's reach. A woman whispered, her voice breaking, "Oh my God, he's Internal Affairs." Another young man shouted, unable to hold back, "He just hit the head of Internal Affairs." The words echoed, setting off waves of chatter, outrage, and disbelief. No one could grasp how the man thrown onto the hood, searched, and slapped in public had actually been the one with authority to investigate and punish people like Rowan. Rowan stood frozen, his hand trembling on the grip of his gun. His face went pale, his lips parted deed, but no words came out. He stumbled half a step back, feet unsteady, like a man just shot in the chest. Light from dozens of phones flashed across his face, revealing every drop of sweat, every strained vein on his forehead, and the panic he could no longer hide. In that moment, all the power he thought he held slipped through his fingers like sand. Darius lowered the badge to eye level, his voice calm but razor sharp. "You just abused your authority, committed assault, and pointed a gun at the head of the agency that oversees your department. And everything you've done is now in the hands of dozens of phones around us." He turned slightly to glance at the crowd, meeting the lenses aimed at him, and for the first time after a long, stifling silence, the crowd erupted in shouts and curses aimed at Rowan. "Keep recording," an old man's voice called from the back. "Don't let him walk away," a young man yelled. "Justice will see this." Dozens of voices rose together, forming a wave of force that pushed back against the silence Rowan had once used as a shield. The rage that had been restrained too long now exploded, and for the first time Rowan realized he was surrounded by a crowd no longer willing to obey him. He tried to shout, voice cracking, "Don't believe him, it's fake," but his words vanished in the roar of voices and flashing lights. A woman screamed back, "We saw the badge, we know the truth." Rowan flailed, eyes darting, clinging to the last shred of pride, but in the eyes of the dozens watching him, he was nothing now but a coward exposed. Darius stood firm, gaze unshaken, and spoke again, not just to Rowan, but like a declaration to everyone. Power does not exist to humiliate the people. Power exists to protect justice, and from this moment forward, justice will be recorded in this light. He nodded towards the phones lighting up the street. The cheers swelled, rolling like a wave down the block. Rowan stepped back again, his back hitting the patrol car, sweat dripping down the collar of his shirt. In his eyes, the flashing lights from countless phones felt like thousands of eyes exposing everything. He had once been used to the feeling of control, of being the one who made crowds fall silent. But now he was tasting the reversal, and for the first time he realized that silence had vanished, replaced by a roar that couldn't be stopped. A young man turned to his friend, breathing hard. "This is a moment no one will forget." His friend nodded firmly, hand gripping his phone tight. "Yeah, this is evidence that'll make sure he never gets away." In their eyes, fear had faded, replaced by a mix of adrenaline and fury. Darius slowly lowered the badge, leaving behind the charged silence between him and Rowan. But this silence was no longer the weapon of an oppressor, it had become the calm before the next eruption. And in that exact moment, the history of the quiet suburban street shifted as an unexpected twist turned the humiliated man into the one holding judgment, and the man with the gun into a criminal under the public spotlight. The downtown bar, usually loud with music and clinking glasses late at night, shifted unexpectedly in atmosphere tonight. A large screen mounted on the wall suddenly displayed a short video on loop, flashing police lights, Officer Rowan shouting, then slapping Darius across the face, followed by the moment a gleaming badge was pulled out. The music cut off as someone hit pause, giving way to a suffocating silence. All eyes turned to the screen where the truth played out clearly, undeniably. A group of young men near the window shot up, faces burning with anger. One of them shouted, "What kind of cop slaps someone in public like that?" The question hit everyone watching, sparking a surge of voices. People who had been halfway through their beers set their glasses down, faces tightening. A young woman in a leather jacket snapped, "That's how they protect us, with guns and fists instead of the law." Her sharp voice drew a wave of furious agreement from the next table. The video played again, and this time dozens of phones were raised across the bar. Everyone wanted to capture it, share it, spread it faster. An older man with a weathered face shook his head. Slowly, voice hoarse and heavy. "I've seen plenty of police abuse, but never this clear. This isn't a rumor. This is proof." He finished, took a sip of strong liquor, eyes dark and distant. In the corner, two bartenders leaned in close. One whispered, "If he's really the head of internal affairs, then that slap wasn't just violence, it just dug a grave for the whole department." The other swallowed hard, eyes fixed on the screen, voice catching in their throat. "If this gets ignored too, we'll lose all faith in the system." The wave of talk didn't stop there. A group of students opened social media apps, scrolled to trending topics, and weren't surprised to find the clip at the very top, millions of views, hundreds of thousands of comments. Hashtags exploded, demanding justice, demanding investigation, even calling for the officer's immediate punishment. A girl with bright eyes held her phone up, voice trembling but firm. "We're not letting this be forgotten. People need to see this." Outside the bar, streetlights spilled across the passing crowd, many holding phones playing the same video. Voices filled the corners of the street, echoing off windows. Some were angry, some disturbed, but most felt the exposure was a direct strike at the trust that had long been fraying. Strangers exchanged glances, silently acknowledging a shared truth. This was the moment they couldn't turn back from. Inside the bar, a young man in a white shirt slammed his hand on the table, voice erupting, "We can't just sit here and be angry. Someone has to speak up officially. There needs to be an immediate investigation." His voice rang out, followed by a surge of agreement. Another man stood, eyes locked on the screen. He abused his power right in front of everyone. If he's not held accountable, what does the law even mean? The video kept looping, and with each replay the outrage only deepened. That slap was no longer seen as a moment of lost control from a rogue officer. It had become a symbol of blatant abuse of power. And the image of Darius holding up his badge, surrounded by flashing lights from dozens of phones, had become a declaration that the truth had been sealed. The entire bar felt like a powder keg waiting for a single spark to ignite action. As people left the bar, each carried the same feeling, chest tight with anger and resolve. They were no longer just bystanders. They had become messengers, taking the video beyond the four walls of the bar, letting it ripple through every corner of the city. With each share, each comment, another piece of silence was chipped away, replaced by an ever-growing roar demanding justice. Across social media, short messages tagged with #JusticeForCole spread like a storm. From small personal accounts to major influencers, the phrase repeated endlessly, often paired with the clip of Rowan slapping Darius and then dropping his gaze as the badge was raised. Within hours, the video had surpassed millions of views, numbers climbing by the minute, trailed by hundreds of thousands of furious comments. Every frame of the clip was being pulled out, turned into symbols, plastered across digital posters, profile pictures, and conversations. Post after post appeared. "This is proof of abuse. We can't stay silent any longer. Every eye saw it, and we won't look away." On forums, people dissected every detail from Rowan's shout to the instant his hand struck Darius's face. Calls for investigation and justice quickly drowned out any vague defense. Under every shared video, the hashtag #JusticeForCole appeared more and more, becoming a collective rallying cry from a public pushed to the edge. Meanwhile, at local police stations, tension blanketed the air. Urgent emails were sent non-stop, and frantic phone calls echoed through the night. Orders from higher-ups demanded media control removal of the video from platforms before it could spread further. A tech team rushed to report they had submitted takedown requests, citing the clip as misleading to the public. But within minutes, new copies surfaced faster, sharper, uploaded from thousands of different accounts. Every deletion only fueled the fire, as the video came back each time with even greater force. A high-ranking officer at headquarters stared at the screen, his face dark, voice tight. "We're losing control. The more we block it, the more attention it gets." No one else spoke. There were no solutions, only confusion. Outside the building, reporters had begun to gather microphones pointed at the closed doors. Camera lights flooded the courtyard, waiting for an official response. In cafes, offices, and even on buses, the video continued playing. People discussed it heatedly, their faces marked by both anger and disbelief. An elderly woman by a window whispered, "I've seen plenty in my life, but this is different. This time, the whole world will see." Beside her, a group of high school students tapped furiously on their phones, sharing the video with hashtags, faces burning with a mix of outrage and energy. Darius Cole became the center of every conversation, not only as a victim, but as a symbol of resistance against injustice. The calls to spread the truth kept surging, pulling more people into the growing wave. And despite the local police's efforts to suppress it, anyone who logged onto the internet could see the slap, followed by the moment Rowan stepped back in panic as the gleaming badge was raised. The attempt to contain the story collapsed, and in the authorities' helplessness, the outrage moved beyond just a viral clip. It had become a movement, a legitimate demand, and nothing could stop it now. The next morning, the city's central square was no longer a place for leisurely strolls or bustling street markets. Hundreds poured in, carrying banners and signs boldly painted with red-lettered slogans. "Justice is not a privilege." The chants echoed in unison, joined by drums and whistles bouncing off the glass walls of high-rise buildings, creating a resonance that shook the entire city. Faces of all ages, students, workers, elderly, with silver hair stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes burning with both hope and fury. A young woman raised a poster showing a fist breaking free from chains beside a shaky yet powerful caption, "No one stands above the law." National news channels quickly arrived, media vans raising tall antennas, cameras sweeping across the sea of people, capturing every face screaming for justice. In the broadcast studio, urgent bulletins aired continuously, and live footage from the square was shown during prime time. The anchor voice, tense, announced, "The largest protest in the past decade is underway, all sparked by a viral video circulating across social media. Citizens demand clear answers from the authorities." On social platforms, live feeds from the square drew millions of viewers, thousands of new comments pouring in each minute. Those unable to attend changed their avatars to display slogans, sent words of support, and vowed to keep sharing to sustain the pressure. On-site chants of "Justice for Cole" rose like crashing waves, sweeping away the silence that had long buried forgotten cases. A young student stood on the steps, voice hoarse but still shouting, "If we stay silent today, there will be no one left to speak tomorrow." The crowd roared in unison, the sound shaking the very air. Local police were deployed, metal barricades hastily erected around City Hall, but faced with the overwhelming numbers, officers could only form a loose line, eyes drifting amidst the sea of people. Cameras panned to capture a young officer lowering his gaze quietly, turning away from the crowd's fury. Behind him, a group of lawyers and social activists stepped forward holding files and speaking into microphones. This is not an isolated incident. It is proof of the public's collapsing trust. We demand an immediate investigation and full transparency in the results. Cheers erupted again. Many people raised their phones to stream live, and television networks simultaneously broadcast the scene. Nearby streets were jammed, but no one seemed bothered. All eyes were drawn into the heat of the moment. An elderly man stood at the edge with a cane, eyes gleaming, voice trembling but clear. All my life, I've waited for this day. Justice must not be a privilege. It must be a right for all of us. His words echoed through the microphone, igniting the crowd into a storm of applause. The protest spread not just in the square but across other neighborhoods. People poured into the streets carrying signs, carrying long-held fury. And in every stare, every chant, one message was shared: justice must be served and truth cannot be buried. Amid the blazing slogans in the square, dozens of microphones reached upward, reporters jostling for the perfect frame. A female journalist, pale with tension but steady in voice, held her mic to the camera and asked bluntly, "Can the police still be trusted?" The short question hit like an arrow slicing through the thick air, turning the quiet doubt long held by the public into a raging fire. On television, the footage was broadcast, instantly replayed on every news segment, and spread at lightning speed across social media. People heard the question and began debating everywhere, and spontaneous answers surfaced. The fragile trust was now in free fall. While outside the crowd surged with slogans and deafening chants, Rowan vanished from public view. He was no longer seen at headquarters, absent from any press conference. His home was surrounded by reporters, but only closed curtains and a locked door could be seen. His image, once painted as the face of law and order, was now mocked everywhere. Social media was flooded with caricatures ridiculing his face and the fateful slap, paired with his panicked expression backing away from the shining badge. A local TV channel aired a special segment featuring a stream of guest commentators. Some called Rowan the symbol of corruption. Others saw him as merely the tip of a much deeper iceberg that needed to be shattered. The slap was replayed repeatedly, zoomed in frame by frame, showing every flinch, every bead of sweat on his brow. The humiliation was no longer confined to a single video. It had become a public stain. In cafes, offices, and schools, people passed around the morning papers with bold headlines. "Officer abuses power. Where is the honor of the police?" Below it was an image of Rowan Eye's dazed hand still on the gun grip beside the proud face of Darius. Every glance at the photo carried bitterness and rage. The public was not just furious at one man's actions, but at the way it exposed a system-wide flaw that had steadily eroded trust day by day. On the radio, callers flooded in, their voices heavy with emotion. A middle-aged man spoke with a weary tone. "I taught my kids to respect the police, but now I don't know what to tell them." A young mother broke down, her voice trembling as she confessed, "My child watched the clip and asked why that man was hit. I didn't have an answer." These small stories spread, becoming puzzle pieces that completed the picture of growing outrage. The more Rowan hid, the more his image was mocked. A satirical newspaper featured a front page that read, "Who's Hero?" alongside a cartoon of him backing away as a shining badge glared in front of him. Below, thousands of comments poured in, adding sarcastic remarks. Every movement, every expression he made in the clip became a punchline, but behind the laughter burned a deeper anger, a serious erosion of trust in the entire local police force. The ridicule did not stay confined to the city. Major national papers and even some international outlets began covering the story. The situation between Rowan and Darius was no longer a neighborhood incident. It had become a symbol of something larger, a crack in the power structure. And as the question, "Can the police still be trusted?" kept echoing through the media, the public had already found their answer, not with words, but with their feet on the streets, with signs held high, and with a fury that could no longer be silenced. Inside the brightly lit federal building, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Thick marble walls reflected solemnity, long wooden tables lined with neatly stacked documents and files. At the center of the conference room, Darius Cole sat upright in the chair at the head of the table, the national seal mounted high in front of him, legal aides standing silently behind. A sense of formality blanketed the room, all eyes focused on him. Cole looked across the faces, breathing steady. His voice rang out strong and clear. "I am not just a victim. I am the one responsible for this investigation." The declaration echoed, marking the shift from a personal incident to an official inquiry. Federal officials, seated along both sides of the table, scribbled notes, a few nodding in agreement. Cole continued, his voice lowering, but each word etched into the room. "The video is no longer sensational news. It is undeniable evidence. And when evidence is exposed, none of us has the right to stay silent." Pens moved swiftly across paper, the screen glowing with the image of Rowan stumbling back in panic as the badge was raised. A female attorney stood, her tone composed. "The public demands answers. Without a clear response, this wave of outrage will only grow stronger." Cole met her gaze, his eyes unwavering. "We don't respond because of pressure. We act because justice demands it. And justice means launching a full investigation." He signaled to an aide to bring up a new file. The large screen displayed streams of data from Rowan's personnel records to civil complaints once buried in drawers. Silence filled the room as everyone realized this was not just about a single officer. It was part of a much bigger picture of decay and discipline and erosion of public trust. Cole stood, placing his hand on the thick stack of files, his gaze sweeping across the room. "We will broaden the scope. This doesn't stop at one slap. I want the entire process reviewed, from those who gave orders to those who stayed silent. No one is exempt." A national security advisor laced his fingers together, his voice cautious. "You know, this won't be easy. Many will try to obstruct. Powerful forces will push back." Cole lifted his head, his voice resolute. "Justice has never been easy. But if we let fear decide we turn wrongdoing into standard practice, I won't let that happen." At the end of the table, a young staffer took a deep breath, his eyes glowing with conviction. He whispered to a colleague beside him, "This is the first time I've seen someone inside the system say that out loud." The quiet words mirrored a shared feeling in the room where trust had begun to stir again. Cole returned to his seat, placed both hands on the table, and lowered his voice, firm and unwavering. "This investigation won't be for the press or public opinion. It will be for the truth. And the truth is what we owe the people." He paused, then signaled the clerk to record the statement into the official minutes, marking the beginning of a process that would reshape the entire system. Outside the federal building, the crowd continued to gather, waving signs and chanting, but inside a different front had been opened. From the moment Cole delivered that declaration, everything shifted to a new chapter where the investigation was no longer a choice, but a duty. And with the steely look in his eyes, no one doubted that this would be a relentless pursuit, bringing the truth to light at any cost. Once the order to proceed was issued, the federal office's conference room quickly became a hub for new voices. Witnesses were summoned, each with a tense expression, but united by one goal: to recount what they had seen with their own eyes. The woman, who had hidden her phone in her coat pocket, stood first, her hands still trembling as she held her statement. Her voice was choked but steady, detailing every moment from the slap, the shouting, to the instant the badge flashed clearly and completely. A legal aide took rapid notes, occasionally looking up to confirm details, while Cole's gaze remained fixed on her, as if assuring her that the truth she brought forth would not be buried. Next was the young man who had shouted from the crowd. He walked in uncertainly, but when questioned, his voice rose with intensity. "I couldn't stay silent because I clearly saw him being insulted and hit right in front of all of us. I heard every slur, and I saw when he put his hand on his gun." The room fell silent, and everyone focused on his testimony, firmly validating what the video had already shown. Another witness, the elderly man with the cane who had encouraged people to keep filming, stood slowly, eyes filled with pride. He spoke briefly in a deep tone. "I've lived nearly 70 years, and I've never seen something so raw. No one can justify that act. What we need is justice, not excuses." His words left the room in silence, followed by the steady tapping of pens confirming every word had been recorded. Testimonies followed one after another, gradually forming a complete picture of the incident. Every story, every trembling glance, recalling the event, felt like needles piercing through the false wall Rowan had once built. The lights in the hearing room cast a glow across Cole's face where he sat silently, yet his eyes were filled with resolve, taking in each statement as a necessary piece in completing the puzzle of justice. Meanwhile, across the room, Rowan sat hunched over, his face a darkened sweat beating across his forehead. Every time a witness mentioned his name, every detailed recounting of humiliation and violence struck like a hammer blow. He shifted at times, forcing a strained smile as if to appear composed, but the faint tremble in his hand resting on his knee betrayed him. Some in the room stared at him with contempt. Others simply shook their heads, unable to believe how quickly his arrogance had crumbled. The pressure from the testimonies continued to build. Outside, the crowd was still protesting, but inside, the pressure was no less intense. It didn't come from chants or slogans, but from truth spoken again and again. Rowan was no longer the proud officer in uniform. He was now just a man cornered, with each witness's word tightening the noose around his neck. Cole looked at him not with hatred, but with an icy calm. He knew this was only the beginning, yet the weight bearing down on Rowan was unmistakable, and there was no way out. There was no one left to defend him, no silence to hide behind, only the truth laid bare under the light of justice. The hearing room felt even heavier after a flurry of testimonies. Rowan sat motionless for a long time, his eyes lost, but finally he looked up, lips pressed tightly, voice hoarse. "I was just following protocol." The brief statement rang hollow among the thick folders and stern gazes of the council. No one responded immediately. Silence spread across the room as if all were waiting for a clearer justification. Cole slowly leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on Rowan, his voice low and firm. "What protocol allows you to slap an innocent citizen?" The question cut through like a blade slicing apart the fragile shield Rowan had tried to put up. Every eye turned to him, each gaze a weight pressing down on his slumped shoulders. Rowan fidgeted, breathing fast, rubbing his hands together under the table. He lowered his voice, struggling to form an excuse. He was uncooperative, displayed a hostile attitude. I only acted to ensure safety for myself and everyone around." The words came out disjointed, patchy, like a flimsy cloth, failing to cover the truth already exposed. A council member cleared their throat, scribbled a few more notes, a faint, bitter smile crossing their face. Cole spoke with precise rhythm, each word firmer than the last. "You call that hostility? A man standing still, being searched unarmed. What safety comes from a public slap? Or was that just your way of proving you could do whatever you wanted?" He paused, eyes blazing, and Rowan couldn't lift his head. He stammered, "I was under pressure. The crowd surrounding me, people filming. I had to maintain control. That's how officers are trained." His voice reached out, but no one in the room was convinced. A legal advisor near the door shook his head, set his pen down, and sighed audibly. The woman who had testified earlier furrowed her brow, her hands clenched tight. Cole leaned forward slightly, tapping the file in front of him, his voice low but sharper than ever. "If maintaining control means humiliating a citizen that's not training, that's abuse of power. And when you abuse power on camera, it's no longer a mistake. It's irrefutable evidence." The room held its breath, the atmosphere frozen in place. Rowan tried to speak again, but the words caught in his throat, only fragments escaping. I didn't mean to. I just... He trailed off, unable to continue. Sweat beaded on his forehead, streaking down his cheek. His eyes darted around, searching for sympathy, but all he found were cold, unforgiving stares. A council member finally spoke, voice calm but firm. "You call that unintentional when you raise your hand to strike a citizen, when you draw your weapon to threaten you, think that's routine behavior. That kind of unintentional act has shattered the trust this entire community placed in its police." The sound of pens tapping resumed, underlining the isolation now closing in around Rowan. Cole straightened his voice, firm and final. "You weren't forced to do it. You chose to, and that choice will speak for who you are. Don't use the word protocol as a shield, because no protocol permits an officer to humiliate and assault a citizen." Rowan stayed silent, his hands clenched until pale fingers trembling. The flimsy excuse he had just offered dissolved, leaving him with nothing to lean on. In that room, every attempt at justification became another weight added to his shoulders, and when Cole's eyes swept over him again, he knew there wasn't a single crack wide enough for him to escape through. Rowan's stammered reply fell into the room like a stone dropped into a deep pit. No one caught it, no one responded. The council sat in a long row, their eyes on documents or staring straight ahead with not a single word offered in his defense. That silence wasn't indifference. It was an unspoken verdict, a collective agreement that his words had failed to convince anyone. He sat still, heart pounding, realizing the wall of authority that once held him up had vanished, leaving behind only a cold void. By that very afternoon, headlines exploded across the press. Bold black letters flooding front pages, "Officers lie exposed." Below was a photo of Rowan, pale-faced eyes dodging, as he was questioned, alongside captions dissecting every contradiction in his testimony. Images comparing the incident video with his statements were placed side by side, leaving readers with no room for doubt. From coffee shops to subway cars, people passed newspapers hand to hand, and debates erupted, most of them fueled by outrage over his blatant dishonesty. Television channels ran non-stop special reports. Footage of Darius holding up his badge contrasted with Rowan's panicked expression, played on a loop. Commentators broke it down. The truth has been clearly documented. There is no protocol that justifies a slap and public humiliation. Those words echoed across living rooms, diners, and offices, turning the incident into one of the most explosive controversies in recent memory. On online forums, the wave of outrage grew more intense. Rowan's phrase, "I followed protocol," was mocked into a sarcastic catchphrase, turning it into a symbol of meaningless justification. The image of Rowan with his head down in the hearing room was shared with thousands of satirical captions, spreading like a bitter joke about a system exposing its own cracks. Meanwhile, in-depth investigative reports began resurfacing old records revealing that Rowan had previously faced multiple civilian complaints that were all dismissed. Cole followed everything from his office, showing no exaggerated emotion, but his eyes held a steady fire. He knew the weight of public pressure was now the strongest lever to ensure the investigation wouldn't be buried. Every headline, every banner reading, "Officers lie exposed," was more than just news. It was implicit evidence not only against Rowan but demanding the entire system reflect on itself. Meanwhile, Rowan was entirely isolated. Colleagues who once shook his hand now avoided him. His phone rang endlessly without a single message of support. Each news update felt like another blow to a career already unraveling. He sat alone in his cramped room, trembling hands, flipping through a newspaper headlined with condemnation. Beneath his portrait, the bold caption read, "When the truth is revealed, lies become an empty shell." Outside, the public's fury hadn't cooled. Social justice groups continued to march, chanting slogans, holding up images of the slap as proof of systemic rot. Rowan's weak defense, instead of saving him, had become the catalyst that ignited even greater fury. And in that landscape, his name was no longer linked to the title officer, but had become a symbol of unmasked deceit. After days of mounting tension while the public outrage on the streets had yet to settle, the federal investigative team officially released the first set of documents. On the large screen in the center of the hearing room, security footage from cameras around the neighborhood played stitched together into a seamless sequence. Different angles from the grocery store, parking lot, and traffic pole at the intersection all captured the moment Rowan stopped the car, shouted, and forced Darius down onto the hood. As the footage played, the room fell silent, filled only with the scratch of pens and quickened breaths. A technician stood by the electronic board, zooming in on specific details. On the screen, Rowan's hand swung hard. The sound of the slap echoed clearly from a nearby street microphone, followed by the crowd's gasps. That slap repeated on screen was no longer hearsay or subjective. It was truth recorded by an unfeeling lens. Rowan's insults rang out through the room, each word chilling the listeners. "Black men don't belong in luxury cars. You're garbage." The phrases spilled out cold and raw, as undeniable as written testimony. When the footage reached the moment his hand moved toward the gun, the room tensed. A streetlight camera caught Rowan's grip on the holster, the flash of metal glinting under the lamp. Several committee members furrowed their brows and one shook his head and sighed. The accompanying audio data captured screams and threats, leaving no room for interpretation or defense. Each file played added to a tight net of evidence, leaving no space for denial to slip through. Cole sat still in the presiding chair, eyes following each frame. His face remained calm, but his hand on the table clenched slightly. He knew the truth had fully surfaced, and the only thing left was the judgment against a man who once believed himself untouchable. He spoke slowly, voice steady. "You've all seen it, not from one but multiple independent sources. The slap, the insults, the hand on the weapon. They're all here." The council nodded, quiet murmurs rising from the observation seats. A young female attorney stood, her voice sharp. "With this level of evidence, there is no room for justification. This is a pattern, not a mistake. This is a crime committed against a citizen, and more gravely, against the sanctity of the law itself." Her statement hung in the air, making the room feel even heavier. Rowan sat there, his back soaked in sweat, eyes darting around, searching for a gap in the chain of images. But the more he looked, the more everything closed in like an iron ring. No one turned to defend him, no voice rose to save him, only cold faces, pens still moving, and footage playing on loop. Outside, the press quickly spread the news headlines glowing across screens. Cameras uncover the truth. Violence beyond denial. People passed around the official footage and the fury reignited with even more intensity. Online, close-up frames of Rowan raising his hand of him, shouting insults became widespread evidence, accompanied by calls for sweeping reform. Inside the room, Cole closed the presentation, his voice firm and clear. "The truth is no longer deniable, and with that truth, justice must speak." The words echoed, sealing the sequence of images just shown. Rowan collapsed into his seat, face pale, knowing the chains had tightened and there was no escape. As footage from multiple sources was released, the public erupted into a new wave of protest. But inside the investigation room, the pressure mounted even higher. A group of civil rights attorneys officially stepped in, bringing thick files containing dozens of past complaints against Rowan, complaints that had been dismissed or silenced. Their representative stood, voice sharp. "We've tracked numerous abuse of power cases, and this incident cannot be separated from a system that has long enabled wrongdoing. This is no longer the story of one individual, but an indictment of how public trust has been trampled." Her words struck the tense room, forcing many heads to lower. The bright lights reflected off each photo, each video, replaying side by side as the attorneys took turns pointing out contradictions in Rowan's statements, highlighting every undeniable detail. They fired questions in rapid succession, introduced additional evidence, and rendered all his justifications meaningless. An older lawyer declared every slap wasn't just violence, it was a declaration that power can crush dignity, and if this is left unchallenged, it sets a dangerous precedent. Rowan slumped deeper in his chair, sweat soaking his back, eyes wild with panic. He searched for something to cling to, but everything had turned away. Each lawyer's word, each enlarged image on screen landed like a hammer blow, shattering the shell of arrogance he had once tried to uphold. He bowed his head to the table, hands clasped tightly, trembling lips, moving but unable to form words. His attempts to cover up his earlier weak excuses had now become a bitter joke. No one in the room needed to say more because the truth had drowned out every excuse. The air was heavy as lead, pressing down on the man who was once used to standing in power. A few members of the council exchanged glances, but there was nothing except a shared resolve to see this through. Rowan was nearly collapsed, his body curled on the wooden chair, hair slick with sweat, eyes vacant. All the pride that had once fueled his shouting in the street was now a blurred shadow under the harsh light of justice. The press moved quickly. Headlines across papers declared, "Civil rights lawyers step in. Wall of cover-ups crumbles." Images of Rowan slumped forward, his dazed eyes vacant, spread at lightning speed, becoming proof that the truth had cornered him. On social media, hundreds of thousands of comments poured in, many saying the moment marked not just the fall of a man, but the collapse of the illusion that the badge made one untouchable. Outside the building, the crowd kept chanting, each slogan echoing off the glass doors. Handwritten signs were held high, and the eyes of the protesters lit up with belief that justice was drawing closer. They were no longer just angry. They now felt the weight of real change. And it had all come from undeniable evidence, from voices that refused to stay silent, building a pressure strong enough to force the man who once raised a gun to finally lower his head. On the morning of the trial, the federal courtroom was packed, every row of seats filled with journalists, activists, and regular citizens. Outside, hundreds stood shoulder to shoulder holding up bright red signs reading, "Justice is not a privilege," and "Justice for Cole." Their chants, echoing off the glass doors, merging the energy inside and out into a single force. On nearby streets, police set up metal barricades to manage the crowd, but the slogans continued to thunder, casting a heavy pressure over the entire proceeding. Inside, the witness seats glowed under camera lights, the public watching every detail. Darius Cole sat in the front row, his face composed, eyes steady. Across from him, Rowan arrived in a dark suit, hair disheveled, looking worn and drained, nothing like the arrogant figure he once was. He sat low in his seat, hands clenched tightly together, eyes avoiding every lens pointed in his direction. The room was tense, silent enough for the turning of a page to be heard clearly. As the gavel struck, the prosecutor stepped into the center, holding a thick case file. His voice rang out firm and sharp. Charges, abuse of power, racially motivated misconduct. The words hit like a strike, making a few in the gallery gasp audibly. On the press bench, pens flew across notepads, headlines already forming, ready to break. The courtroom stretched tight like a string about to snap. The prosecutor continued outlining each moment, from the slap in the street and the bitter insults to the second Rowan's hand reached for his weapon. He presented video clips projected onto a large screen. The audio of shouting and the sound of the blow echoed, causing some in the audience to flinch, others to grip the armrests of their seats. The moment the badge was raised and Rowan stepped back in fear, replayed, sparking a wave of murmurs through the gallery. Witness testimonies and federal investigative documents were presented one by one, stacked like tightly fitted bricks forming a solid wall. Every detail aligned, leaving no gaps. Civil rights lawyers seated nearby nodded firmly, a few exchanging glances of approval as new evidence emerged. The space became a stage for exposing truth where no excuse could survive. Rowan shifted occasionally, lips moving without sound, never daring to interrupt. He sat hunched, hands trembling, sweat collecting and dripping down his pale face. When he dared glance up, he met Darius's steady eyes and instantly looked away. That moment, captured on camera, would soon become a defining image across headlines everywhere. On the public benches, many people held hands, some shedding tears as the charges were read aloud with clarity. They were not only hearing about a single incident, but also the echoes of countless buried stories. The question, can the police still be trusted, seemed to resonate within the courtroom itself, with the answer revealed through each undeniable piece of evidence. When the prosecutor concluded the presentation, the gavel struck 3 times and the courtroom fell completely silent. Everyone understood this was only the beginning of the trial, yet the tension had already reached its peak. Outside, the crowd continued chanting their rhythm, pounding against the walls as if to remind everyone that justice no longer lived on paper, but was being demanded to appear right here, right now. The courtroom air thickened after the indictment was read. All whispers faded, leaving only the sound of pens moving and the occasional creak of wooden chairs. Darius Cole sat upright in the front row, his face calm, eyes fixed on Rowan. He stared without blinking, unwavering, like a light piercing through every falsehood once constructed. In that moment, everyone could feel the confrontation, one side silent, carrying the pride of justice, the other trembling, seeking refuge in shadows. Rowan sat across, body slumped forward, hands tightly clasped, sweat streaming down his forehead. He glanced left, then right, but ultimately dropped his gaze, unable to meet Cole's needle-like stare. Each time he looked up, that gaze forced him to shrink, to bow his head as if standing before a tribunal of conscience rather than a legal court. The moment was captured by a press photographer, the flash lighting up the sharp contrast that could not be denied. The suffocating silence gripped the courtroom. No one dared make a sound, as if even the slightest noise could shatter the fragile tension. The ceiling fan's hum became painfully loud, the rustle of paper echoing inward. Rowan's heavy breathing mixed with the furious scribbling of reporters created a chaotic soundtrack, all of it orbiting the steady, unwavering eyes of Cole. A judge tapped the gavel lightly, his voice calm but firm. The trial will proceed with the cross-examination. Immediately, the room brightened, light concentrating on Rowan as if to drag him from his fragile shell. He swallowed hard, trying to form a defense, but before he could speak, prosecutor stood and his icy voice rang out. "Mr. Rowan, do you deny what the witnesses and the videos have clearly shown?" Rowan opened his mouth, but no words came out. His silence only heightened the pressure. A few spectators whispered their murmurs, rippling like small waves, but quickly faded as everyone waited for his response. Darius remained still, his gaze steady like a rock in a rushing stream, making Rowan feel even more suffocated. In the following minutes, one by one, civil rights attorneys stood up, emphasizing undeniable details from the audio captured in the clip to the footage from security cameras. They not only accused Rowan, but questioned the system itself, asking how many similar incidents had been buried under a veil of silence. Their voices rang with force, echoing through the enclosed space, prompting the audience to respond with a wave of desk taps in agreement. Rowan seemed to shrink, his large frame now hunched into the rigid chair. Each time the prosecution repeated the charges, he closed his eyes, hands trembling as if trying to reject the present moment. But Cole's gaze, unblinking, unwavering, stayed fixed on him, drowning him in an inescapable truth. The entire courtroom fell silent, waiting for the final verdict. That suffocating tension stretched on, pressing down on everyone, making it clear that the moment of reckoning was near. And in that moment, the image of Cole sitting upright, eyes blazing, and Rowan slumped in defeat etched itself into the minds of all as a stark contrast between justice and abuse of power. The courtroom fell completely silent as the judge stood, their stern face lit by the stark white light from above. The sharp crack of the gavel echoed through the stone walls and into the chests of everyone present. The judge's voice rang out firm and clear, each word heavy as iron. This court finds the defendant, Blake Rowan, guilty of abuse of power and racially motivated conduct. The room erupted as the tension built over so many days finally broke loose in that moment. Cheers burst from the audience seats, a wave of sound surging forward, carrying the fury, pain, and demand for justice that had long awaited this moment. Placards shot into the air, dozens of camera flashes fired in unison, capturing history as it happened. Outside the courthouse, chants of justice for Cole spread across the square, forming a rhythm that matched the gavel's final strike. Hundreds clapped the applause, crashing down like a summer rain, drowning out sirens and loudspeakers alike. Darius Cole remained still, his eyes closing briefly as if to lock the moment into memory. When he opened them, he didn't look at Rowan but toward the judge's bench where justice had finally spoken. He didn't cheer, didn't smile in triumph, only sat quietly with a calm expression, understanding this wasn't a personal victory, proof that justice still had a voice. Rowan, by contrast, collapsed into his chair, shoulders slumped like something had snapped. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, all trace of arrogance gone. The roar of the crowd outside pierced him like 1,000 needles into a pride already shattered. Those who once protected him stood silent, no one stepping forward. He had become the symbol of disgrace, exposed before the public with no way out. The media missed nothing. Cameras swept the room, capturing every angle of Rowan's bowed head and defeated stare. At the same time, frames of Darius, sitting steady eyes unwavering, streamed across television networks. Online news ran bold headlines, "Justice Speaks, Rowan Found Guilty." On-air commentators declared, "This is not just a verdict against one man, it is a wake-up call to an entire system." Outside, the cheering continued, joined by drums from the protest groups beyond the barricade. An elderly woman wiped tears and raised a wooden sign scrawled with, "We waited too long for this day." A group of young students stood shoulder to shoulder, embracing their faces, lit with joy, as if witnessing a moment history would never forget. Everyone knew this verdict wouldn't erase old wounds, but it offered hope that new ones wouldn't be so easily made again. When order was restored, the judge struck the gavel one last time, voice calm but commanding. "Court is adjourned." The noise still echoed, but that moment had become a milestone. Darius rose and walked slowly outside, blending into the flashes of cameras and the roar of thousands. He didn't look at Rowan because he knew the verdict no longer belonged to just the two of them, but to everyone who had ever been silenced, insulted, or longed to see justice carried out. Outside, the sky seemed clearer, sunlight shining down on the square, where the sea of people continued to clap and raise their signs. In that crowd, faith had been reignited, the belief that truth can be buried but never erased. And today, it had spoken through the gavel of justice. As the verdict was announced, the atmosphere outside the courthouse split into two opposing currents. The cheers of those celebrating justice thundered like a storm, but mixed within were fierce cries of protest from an extremist group. They waved flags, held signs defending Rowan, shouting that the verdict was unjust, a political setup. Some grew aggressive, shoving barriers, throwing plastic bottles, and hurling insults at Darius's supporters. Police rushed to reinforce barricades, straining to contain the chaos threatening to turn violent. Sirens wailed, red and blue lights flashed across the pavement, heightening the tension. Inside, Cole walked slowly out of the courtroom. The heavy wooden doors opened, and the light from dozens of cameras hit his face. He didn't smile, nor show triumph. His expression remained cold and composed, just as it had from the start. His eyes didn't pause for any lens, nor seek applause. His stride was straight, every step steady, as if the verdict was not his personal victory, but merely one necessary moment in a longer journey. Reporters crowded in microphones pointed questions flying, but he said nothing, moving past the crowd with unwavering eyes. The crowd outside split in two, one side chanting his name, the other glaring with hostility. Cole's demeanor stayed the same as he walked through it all untouched. Some patted his shoulder, some reached out to touch him, but he didn't stop. His calm presence amid the chaos etched itself into everyone's memory. A man not seeking praise nor bowing to threats, walking with the firm belief that justice must be upheld with clarity, not celebration. The media captured the entire scene, broadcasting it live across the nation. On screen, the image of Cole between two opposing crowds became a symbol. People talked, analyzed, and many outlets commented that he chose silence and a oath to turn this victory into revenge, but to mark it as a reminder that truth can stand on its own. In cafes, on the streets everywhere, his story continued to spread, no longer a personal matter, but a shared story of society. Rowan was taken away shortly after to a mix of jeers and gloating. But, in contrast to his collapse, Cole's composed exit drew even more public attention. People realized that sometimes victory doesn't need a smile, but demands solemnity to remind us that much remains to be done, many battles are not yet over. And it was that calm resolve that left a greater impact than any cheer could. The atmosphere outside the courthouse lingered into the evening. As the streetlights turned on, the crowd slowly dispersed, but the signs remained handwritten slogans still visible under the soft yellow glow. The story didn't end with the verdict, it only opened a new chapter where the public would continue to monitor and demand more from the system. Cole understood that well, and his unreadable expression as he left the courthouse was proof that he was ready for what would come next. A week after the trial, as the city's rhythm slowly returned to normal, the aftershock of the verdict continued to spread. In many schools, teachers actively used the clip that had shaken society as a special civic lesson. In brightly lit classrooms, the big screen replayed the moment Darius was forced down onto the hood. The shouting echoed in students' ears, followed by the flash of the badge and the eruption of the crowd. Dozens of young eyes were glued to the screen. Whispers filled the room. Some children's mouths dropped open, unable to believe a police officer could behave that way. When the clip ended, the class fell silent. A boy raised his hand, his eyes both innocent and troubled. Why didn't anyone help him when he was being hit? The question rang out, making the whole room pause. The teacher at the front stood still, her hand trembling slightly, eyes lowered to the floor as if searching for an answer. Other students began to murmur. One asked, "There were so many people there. Why didn't they do anything?" Another tilted their head. "If it were me, would I dare to speak up?" The once lively classroom became a place of heavy but earnest debate. The teacher took a deep breath, then said slowly, "Silence often comes from fear, but that fear lets injustice go on. The biggest lesson we must remember is not to let that silence happen again." Her voice cracked, but every word held her students' attention. Those young eyes took it in, and they brought the story home to their families, turning it into a topic of conversation across the city's corners. At home, parents were struck by their children's questions. Many admitted they had stayed silent in the face of injustice, and now faced with such innocent clarity they had no choice but to acknowledge that something had to change. Evening meals became serious discussions with parents explaining justice, civic duty, and promising not to let silence drag on again. The media didn't miss the moment. Many outlets featured the children's questions as a reminder to society. Headlines like "A Classroom Question That Stumped the Adults" or "Is Silence a Sin?" were everywhere. Student interviews aired on television, their voices clear and determined, serving as a blunt reminder that the new generation would not repeat old mistakes. In neighborhoods, small community groups held meetings inviting locals to talk about their rights and duties. They replayed the clip, analyzed it together, stressing the importance importance of recording, of speaking up, of protecting each other in similar situations. Those who had once stood silent now spoke of their shame, using it as a reason to act differently. Each personal story came together as a collective voice, turning the verdict's aftershock into more than satisfaction. It became a foundation for change. Universities opened forums, students debated passionately, many asserting that justice doesn't belong only in courtroom. It begins with each individual willing to speak up. In one discussion, a female student stated clearly, "If we choose silence, we will repeat the same mistake adults have admitted to, and that must never happen again." Applause broke out like a shared vow. The aftershocks of the verdict, the video, and that innocent question reached far beyond legal boundary. They touched a collective consciousness, sparking reflection in each person. The once noisy city now carried a different undertone, one of awareness, a reminder that justice isn't just a verdict in court, but also the smallest action in daily life where each individual bears the responsibility to break the silence in the face of injustice. The moment those innocent questions spilled from students left many teachers choked up, standing before their classes with no words to offer. That hesitation was like a wound exposing a silent pain, because they too had once remained silent during moments of injustice. A young teacher stood at the board, eyes as red, trying to speak but falling silent, knowing no answer could soothe what the children had just witnessed. That lump in the throat spread across the room, turning the usual chatter into a heavy stillness, where every child was left to think deeply about what they had seen. The message from that silence didn't fade. It smoldered and spread. It slowly became an unspoken reminder, reaching into the minds of adults. They began to examine themselves, wondering how many times in their lives they had bowed their heads, letting wrongs pass without resistance. Those questions clung to them on their way home, during dinner, even in restless sleep. At school, the discussions continued, with children talking about what they would do if they saw injustice one day. No perfect answers emerged, but the conversations themselves planted the seeds of courage in a new generation. Outside classrooms, community gatherings began to shift. People talked more about responsibility, about the importance of speaking up. In churches, neighborhood meetings, and local halls, the question, "Why didn't anyone help him when he was being hit?" echoed like a warning, not just to everyday citizens, but to those in authority as well. Many admitted they carried guilt for past silence and decided to turn that guilt into action, so that one day if their children asked, they could answer truthfully they had stood up. On social media, the message spread in many forms, from black and white photos capturing the moment of the slatoto simple phrases like, "Silence is complicity." These posts circulated like an underground stream, quiet but persistent. People no longer focused on blaming individuals. They began to discuss deeper change, asking what each person must do to end the silence that blankets injustice. In homes, parents sat down with their children, not avoiding the subject, but honestly discussing how to act in difficult situations. Many children said they didn't want to repeat the indifference of adults. Those innocent statements startled the grown-ups, pushing them to change. The social atmosphere after the verdict wasn't just charged on the streets, it crept into classrooms and kitchens, becoming a quiet but powerful call for transformation. Those who had witnessed the incident firsthand also spoke up, sharing the shame they felt for staying silent. They admitted fear had stopped them from speaking out, but now that very shame had become a source of strength. They reminded each other that justice isn't created only in courtrooms, but through small, everyday actions. And that quiet message, repeated enough times, became the foundation of a broader movement where silence was no longer seen as a safe option, but as something that must be broken for truth to shine into every hidden corner. After the trial and the widespread social aftershocks, pressure on the police administration became unbearable. The media reported relentlessly, civil organizations filed petitions, and thousands protested outside City Hall, demanding concrete action instead of hollow promises. In an emergency city council meeting, the sitting police chief was fiercely questioned over a series of exposed incidents, including years of shielding Rowan. Under undeniable pressure, he was forced to sign his resignation, leaving the chamber under cold stares from the public and flashing lights from the press. His bowed figure exiting the city hall was broadcast live, becoming a symbol of unprecedented upheaval within the system. Immediately after federal legislators and the city council began drafting new legislation. Meetings stretched late into the night with the sound of deliberations echoing through congressional halls, all centered on a single goal: to curb arbitrary search authority and establish transparent standards to protect citizens. Drafts were released to the press and opened for public feedback. For the first time, people felt their voices truly mattered. Many provisions emphasized mandatory activation of body cameras during all civilian interactions and strictly prohibited searches without just cause. During hearings, numerous legal experts were invited to contribute. One law professor stated bluntly, "Power cannot be a cloak to conceal violence. If the law isn't rewritten, trials like this will keep happening." His words echoed, prompting nods from those present. Outside, the public gathered to watch live broadcasts on large screens set up in the square, cheering each time a bold proposal was made, treating it as a sign of real change. Images of Cole appeared in several hearings. He didn't speak at length, but emphasized one sentence: the law must be written to prevent wrongdoing from the start, not just to punish it afterward. His words became a widely quoted statement, appearing in major publications and spreading quickly across social media. People shared the quote as a guiding principle for a new era, one where change is grounded in legislation rather than delayed justice. Within the police ranks, many young officers began openly expressing their support for reform. They shared that past scandals had made them feel ashamed to wear the uniform. One young officer in a televised interview said, "I want my child to see the police as a source of safety, not fear, and the new law will help us live up to that." His simple yet sincere words left many citizens silent, then clapping in agreement. The new legislation gradually took shape and was passed with overwhelming support. When the final document was signed into law, the city square once again erupted in cheers. People believed this was the first step toward rebuilding fractured trust, turning bitter memories into motivation for a fairer society. The reform not only changed how police conduct themselves, but also reshaped how citizens perceive authority, helping them believe that collective voices can shift an entire system once thought immovable. When the new bill was announced, mixed reactions emerged within the police force. Some veteran officers, long accustomed to the old ways, expressed resistance. They whispered in closed-door meetings, claiming the new law would tie their hands and make the job more dangerous. A few even made bitter remarks, saying public pressure was turning police into puppets. But those voices were few, not strong enough to stop the current chain. The majority, especially the younger generation, spoke up in support. They saw this as a chance to restore honor to the profession, to ensure that the uniform no longer stood for violence and fear, but for trust and safety. At a press conference, Cole appeared before a row of microphones, his gaze calm but resolute. His voice was steady, each word etching itself into the minds of those listening. Power is not a shield for humiliation. Power is granted to protect and uphold human dignity. If we forget that we are no longer enforcers of justice, only abusers of it. That statement immediately appeared in bold on the front pages of major newspapers and was widely shared across social media, becoming the slogan of a new movement. Within the police ranks, the atmosphere also shifted. A special training session was held where young officers stood up and declared their desire to work in a transparent environment, one where misconduct would no longer be covered up. One young officer looked straight into the television camera and spoke with conviction. "We don't want to be identified with those who abuse power. We want to be recognized as protectors." His words moved many watching live, their eyes reflecting a renewed sense of trust. Outside the community continued to show support. Groups that once marched in protest now took part in policy discussions, offering input on how to implement the new law. Citizens realized they were not just spectators but active participants in the reform process. Their involvement ensured that the power of change no longer stayed confined to legal text but reached into every corner of daily life. Cole remained a key figure throughout the process. He never called himself a hero, only someone fulfilling his duty. When asked how he felt after everything, he simply replied, "If there's anything I'm proud of, it's that we proved together silence is not an option." Those modest words earned even more public respect because he sought no spotlight, only emphasized shared values. The reform was taking shape not easily, but with visible progress. More training sessions were held and commitments to transparency were written into regulations. The resistance from a few older officers grew increasingly out of place, while public support and the backing of younger forces continued to rise. A new era in policing was beginning, and Cole's words about power had become the guiding principle of that change. After the tense days in court and the pressure-filled meetings, Cole finally returned to his small suburban home, a place he had rarely visited in the past few months. Stepping through the familiar wooden door, the quiet was so deep he could hear the wind rustling through the trees outside. His daughter ran out, eyes bright but still shadowed with worry. She wrapped her arms tightly around him, the kind of hug that tried to make up for every day he'd been gone. Cole bent down his hand, trembling as it brushed her soft hair, and looked long at her innocent face. He smiled, but it held more than joy, laced with gratitude and a quiet ache not easily eased. That night, after his daughter had fallen asleep, Cole sat alone by the window, a steaming cup of coffee on the table. Moonlight filtered through the thin curtain, casting a soft glow across the room. He suddenly remembered the frightened eyes of the child on the street that day, the boy who had asked his father why the man was being hit. That image returned without warning, sharp as a needle, piercing his chest. Cole closed his eyes, imagining that small face in the silent crowd, those wide eyes full of confusion and pain without a name. He quietly wondered if he hadn't pulled out his badge that day, would everything have turned out differently? Would that look in the boy's eyes become a lifelong scar? The thought chilled him, but it also deepened his resolve that children growing up in this city must see change, not resignation. He understood that justice wasn't just about trials or verdicts, but about giving children simple answers so they never have to ask why innocence is publicly humiliated. Cole stood up, walking slowly around the familiar room, his eyes stopping on the family photo hanging on the wall. In the picture, his wife and daughter beamed with joy, and he stared calmly into the camera. But now, looking back, he saw in his own eyes a kind of quiet compliance, not sharp enough to confront the darkness. He told himself, what's past cannot be changed, but the future can be rewritten, and he had to be the one to keep writing the next chapter. Outside, the echoes of the case still lingered. Slogans remained posted on walls in classrooms and at community meetings. Cole knew he couldn't stay hidden in this peaceful home for long, but he also knew he needed time to breathe, to reflect. His daughter's peaceful, sleeping face became a reminder that all the effort, all the sacrifice, pointed toward one simple goal: for children to grow up in a world where they no longer have to bow before injustice. As dawn approached, Cole stepped out onto the porch, inhaling deeply the scent of the early breeze. He whispered softly, as if making a promise to himself, "They will no longer have to be afraid." The words dissolved into the quiet air, but inside him they rang out like a bell, marking the start of a new day, a new path, where painful memories would become the drive that kept him steady on the road of reform. Cole stood before the old mirror in the living room, his gaze blurring as he looked at himself after so many stormy months. He recalled every second on that street, the crack of the slap, the heavy silence of the crowd, and the panicked eyes of the child who had witnessed it all by chance. That image blurred with the face of his sleeping daughter in the next room, weighing heavily on his chest. He murmured to himself, the hoarse voice like a vow, "If I stay silent, they will grow up in darkness." Those few words clung to his mind like a flame that would not let him collapse. The thought brought him back to the present, where the eyes of the entire city still followed his every move. Cole understood he no longer had the option to retreat, could not treat the past turmoil as the end. He looked out the window, where the sky had begun to brighten, and the first rays of sunlight pierced the treetops, illuminating the road he still had to walk. In that moment, resolve swelled within him, not the resolve of someone who had won, but of someone who had accepted responsibility. He knew he had to become a symbol of reform, not for praise, but so future generations would never again have to ask, why didn't anyone help him when he was being beaten? The media kept trying to follow him, but Cole declined every invitation for praise. Instead, he joined community forums, visited schools, and went to poor neighborhoods to listen and speak. People were surprised to see a man of such a high position sitting with them in small rooms, holding an ordinary cup of tea, eyes focused on every story shared. Each time he spoke, his words were plain and direct, not polished, but that very simplicity made people believe. He didn't promise to fix everything. He only said he would never let silence become the excuse for injustice to return. The image of Cole, calm and resolute, gradually became a symbol. On social media, the words he once spoke were rewritten into slogans printed on posters painted across colorful walls. Phrases like, "Power is not a shield for humiliation," and "If I stay silent, they will grow up in darkness," became mottos passed among youth groups. People no longer saw him as a lone victim, but as a guiding flag for a movement against corruption. Cole understood the weight of that responsibility, but he did not step back. At night, when the small house sank into silence, he remained at his desk reading every report, writing reform proposals, signing petitions. Every stroke of his pen came from the vow he had made to himself, and when he looked up, gazing at his daughter's dreaming face, he saw in her eyes a quiet reminder that the path he had chosen, though steep, was still the right one. For Cole, the painful memory of that day was no longer a wound, but a source of strength. He turned it into power, into a symbol, into resolve. And that very resolve made him the face of reform, not because he sought it, but because the community chose him, placing in him the trust that one day justice would no longer be just a chant in the streets, but a presence in every school, every home, every road. On the weekend night, the city's central square lit up with bright lights and echoing chants. Thousands gathered holding high banners printed boldly with the words, "Silence is complicity." The slogan was no longer just a warning, it had become a collective flame, burning bright in the sea of people. The glow from torches and raised phones stretched across the main avenue, reflecting off glass buildings, turning the entire downtown into a stage for justice. The chants rose steadily, rhythmically, pulsing like the shared heartbeat of the city. On national television, the scene was broadcast live. The anchor's voice trembled with emotion. We are witnessing a moment when a single phrase has become a shared oath for millions. Photos of the square immediately appeared on the front pages of newspapers, becoming symbols of unity and courage. People shared the images with pride, seeing them as proof that out of a painful event, society had found new strength to rise. Cole's words were quickly rewritten, printed on posters, pasted on city walls, and even turned into slogans on T-shirts worn by young people in the streets. From college campuses and office buildings to train stations, the phrase, "Silence is complicity," appeared everywhere, woven into everyday conversation. On social media, it became the top trending hashtag, with millions attaching it to their posts as a declaration that they would never again remain silent in the face of injustice. Many schools incorporated the phrase into civics lessons, with teachers encouraging students to discuss its meaning. In classrooms, buzzing with debate, children raised their hands to declare that silence meant accepting wrongdoing. Student essays on the phrase were shared widely, causing many adults to reflect on the honesty of the younger generation. One boy wrote, "If we don't speak the truth, we'll die." His simple words struck a chord and were widely shared online as a powerful reminder. Beyond national borders, international media also picked up the story. They praised Cole's words for transcending their original context, becoming a universal message about human rights. In other major cities, similar marches were held with people who had never heard of Cole now chanting his words as a shared affirmation. A message born on one street had crossed borders, reaching distant squares where people saw in it the same hope and awakening. In interviews, many activists affirmed that what gave Cole's words such power wasn't his position, but the fact that he had once been a victim, had once stayed silent, and now chose to speak for everyone. That simple truth turned his words into a national slogan, rising above politics or profession. People didn't see Cole as some extraordinary hero, but as someone just like them. The only difference was he had dared to speak. The night in the square ended with thousands of voices rising as one: "Silence is complicity." The chant echoed into the sky. Sky bounced off the walls of high-rises and made the whole city feel like it was trembling. From that moment on, Cole's words were no longer just a reminder tied to one case. They became the slogan of an entire nation, a shared belief that justice never sleeps when people have the courage to speak up. After that radiant night, the movement quickly spread beyond the city. In many other states, marches were held simultaneously. Long lines of people filled major boulevards, raising signs with the slogan, "Silence is complicity." In each location, the voices may have sounded different, but the rhythm was the same, echoing like a massive chorus of awakening. From the bustling eastern seaboard to the quiet towns of the Midwest, the chant rang out, shaking squares that had never seen crowds like this before. National television broadcast images from across the country, forming a live map of a movement unlike anything before. Reporters described how in every place people didn't march for a single incident, but because the message had touched the core of what justice means. Countless signs and banners lined city streets, schools, and even public buses. In one interview, a woman working in the South broke into tears and said, "We march because we don't want our children to grow up afraid. They need to know that justice belongs to everyone." At the same time, many federal civil organizations joined in hosting forums and calling for reform of legal systems and retraining of law enforcement. Universities turned the movement into an academic subject, with students analyzing it from legal and ethical perspectives and turning their research into community projects. The sight of student groups and matching shirts with the slogan "Marching Together" became a common and powerful image during those days. On social media, the wave of momentum showed no signs of slowing down. Clips from federal marches continued to circulate, each share drawing in hundreds of thousands of supportive comments. The hashtag #JusticeForAll surged, alongside "Silence is Complicity," creating two parallel streams of energy, reinforcing that the message was no longer about a single figure or city, but had become a declaration embraced by the entire nation. The political world couldn't look away. Many lawmakers were forced to appear publicly and promised to bring the movement into the national legislative agenda. New hearings were held, and reform proposals were brought into open discussion. Every time a policy advanced even slightly, crowds erupted in cheers, seeing each step as their own victory. For the first time in years, people felt a strong connection between the voices on the streets and the actions taking place in the halls of power. Most importantly, faith in justice, once shaken, was being powerfully restored. People began to believe that justice didn't only reside in marble buildings, but in their own hands and voices. An elderly man marching in a western state told reporters, "I used to think I was too old to see change, but now I know justice can be reborn if we don't give up." His simple words were shared hundreds of thousands of times, seen as proof that the movement spoke not just to the mind, but awakened belief deep in people's hearts. At home, parents told their children about Cole's story, not as a textbook lesson, but as something lived and real. Children listened and remembered, and when they saw the slogans on the streets, they smiled, knowing there were people brave enough to ensure they could grow up in the light. And, in that rekindled belief, society as a whole felt a turning point where justice was no longer distant or abstract, but something to reach for, build, and protect through collective will. A soft, golden light blanketed the city at dawn, the first rays of sunlight piercing through tree canopies casting their glow onto streets still damp with mist. Cole put on his jacket neatly and stepped out into the quiet street where houses were slowly waking up. There were no more chants, no more camera lenses, only the familiar sounds of everyday life, the sweeping of leaves by a street cleaner, the gentle roll of bicycle tires on pavement, the chirping of birds greeting the new day. He took a deep breath, taking in the cool, earthy scent of morning, his gaze distant yet calm. He paused beside a small roadside shop, the glass door reflecting his face. The faint scar at the corner of his mouth caught the sunlight, a remnant of the stormy days past. Cole reached up, touched it gently, and smiled. That smile did not mask pain, but reminded him that every wound could become a mark of strength. In his eyes, the scar was no longer a symbol of humiliation, but a testimony that he had stood up, endured, and transformed pain into a source of belief for the whole community. His steps carried him further along the street, where a few passers-by recognized him and nodded politely. They didn't call out his name or cheer, but offered quiet, sincere looks of respect. Cole returned the nods, warmth blooming in his chest as he realized that trust wasn't built through applause, but through silent acknowledgement from ordinary people. Along the way, he recalled the frightened eyes of the child who had seen him slapped, remembered the student's question in class, "Why didn't anyone help him?" Those memories intertwined, becoming a quiet source of resolve. Cole knew the answer didn't lie in the past, but in the future and how each person chose to act when faced with injustice. And he believed the movement had planted its seed so that the next generation would have the courage to break the silence. As the sun rose higher and the light turned a brilliant white, Cole stopped at a small bridge arching over the river that cut through the city. The water shimmered, carrying away lingering shadows as if reminding him that pain could be washed away if people stayed true to the truth. He leaned against the railing, gazing into the current, and whispered, "Justice is not a destination, but a journey we must walk together." From a distance, church bells rang out, blending with the sounds of a city coming alive. Cole turned back and continued walking his pace, calm, a quiet but proud smile on his face. He no longer carried the weight of shame, but the deep understanding that what had happened was a lesson for an entire generation. The scar on his lip remained not hidden, but worn as a mark to remind himself and others that silence is complicity, and that courage is the only path for justice to endure. In the new dawn, Cole kept walking, not in search of glory, but carrying a simple message: justice exists when people dare to believe, to speak, and to act. And from here, the story no longer belonged to him alone, but became a collective memory, inspiring an entire community to move forward together. As evening fell, the city returned to its usual rhythm, but the echoes of all that had happened still lingered. People in cafes, on buses, or around dinner tables continued to talk about the trial, the reform, and the look in Cole's eyes at the defining moment. The story was no longer a scattered puzzle piece, but a shared memory, a small chapter of history powerful enough to touch every individual. It all came to rest with one simple but weighty sentence: justice may be slow, but it will come. That closing line did not ring from a courtroom podium or a grand speech, but spread quietly by word of mouth through articles and everyday conversations. It became a quiet belief so that when anyone faced injustice, they could still hold on to the hope that truth would eventually find its way back. People came to understand that the most important lesson was not just the sentence passed on one person, but the attitude of the entire community. The days of silent watching, of averted eyes, had become an indelible mark, and from that they learned a hard truth truth silence in the face of injustice is complicity. From small classrooms to large public squares, from teachers' lectures to parents' advice, that message was repeated as a principle. It made people braver, urging them to see that their voices, no matter how small, could be the spark that lit up the dark. On the streets, the slogans no longer echoed loudly as before, but they still appeared on brick walls, on billboards, on the jackets of passers-by. Each phrase served as a reminder that justice needs constant voices, that it needs courage from generations to come. More people began acting differently in their everyday lives. They didn't look away when someone was mistreated, didn't stay silent when hearing slurs, and no longer dismiss the value of their own small actions. Cole, after everything, didn't stand on a pedestal to be praised, but quietly returned to his ordinary life, though his image had become a symbol. Whenever people spoke of him, it wasn't to glorify one man, but to remember a collective journey, the journey of breaking silence, of affirming that justice doesn't come by chance, but through courage. Those memories would eventually make their way into textbooks, become stories passed down to the next generation as a reminder that truth may be buried temporarily, but it never disappears. And so the story came to a close, not with cheers or triumph, but with a quiet reflection. The people understood that justice may come slowly, sometimes painfully slowly, but it will come when enough believe enough, speak up, and enough take action. That is the greatest power, not from authority or weapons, but from shared belief and unyielding determination. The final lesson was etched deep silence in the face of injustice is complicity, and when people dare to break the silence, light will return shining even into the darkest corners. As night fell over the city, the story of Darius Cole and his confrontation with Blake Rowan was no longer just an isolated event, but a milestone engraved in collective memory. From a tense evening on a quiet suburban street where a man was humiliated, beaten, and threatened at gunpoint, everything had erupted into a chain of events that led to a historic trial. The image of Cole calmly revealing his badge, asserting his role as head of internal affairs before a terrified crowd marked the beginning of a societal awakening. From that moment, no one could look away from the truth, and justice, however delayed, was stirred to life. The story continued with a wave of unprecedented outrage. The video, capturing the street incident, spread like wildfire, becoming a flame that ignited public opinion. Protests, intense public debates, media coverage, human rights organizations, and everyday citizens turned what began as a single act of violence into a nationwide conversation about justice, power, and silence. When the trial commenced, the courtroom overflowed with people, and outside the square surged with thousands of signs and chants, all waiting for the final verdict. The moment the judge's gavel struck, declaring Rowan guilty, it was a release for the entire community. But the greater importance was not just in the sentence, but in what it left behind, a renewed belief that justice, though slow, would come. The crowd cheered, but Cole remained composed, walking out of the courthouse with a cold expression, not seeking triumph. His silence wasn't a rejection of relief, but a reminder that the greater fight was still ahead. The impact of the event reached schools, families, and neighborhoods. Children asked innocent questions that left adults speechless, forcing them to reflect. Lawmakers moved quickly to propose reforms, tightening search procedures and curbing arbitrary police power. Some officers resisted, but most chose to support the changes, knowing that the profession's honor could only be restored through transformation. Cole's words, "Power is not a shield for humiliation," became the guiding principle of a new era, echoing from the halls of government to every street corner. The movement against silence spread across states, then beyond borders, becoming a universal message. The slogan, "Silence is complicity," appeared everywhere, from street posters to civics lessons in schools. In this story, people found not only outrage, but also the power of unity, the belief that collective voices could shift an entire system that once seemed immovable. And within that belief, justice was no longer an abstract concept but a tangible presence in the small, everyday actions of a community. Darius Cole, after everything, did not choose to stand as a celebrated hero but quietly became a symbol of reform. The image of him walking through the dawn with a scar on his lip wearing a calm smile stood as proof that pain could become strength, that every fall could be the start of a new path. He understood that if he chose silence, the next generation would grow up in darkness, and it was the courage to speak out that helped ignite belief in millions of people. The story closed with a lesson meant not just for one nation, but for any community. Justice may be hidden, may arrive late, but it will always find its way back. And more important than anything, silence in the face of injustice is complicity. That lesson echoed like a bell, a reminder that every person, no matter how small, has the responsibility to break the silence so justice is no longer a distant promise, but a real part of everyday life.